Does wrestling hurt? Yeah. The long and short of it is it does hurt. I did 36 hours of wrestling training, so trained 6 hours a week for about 6 weeks with WAW, which is the World Association of Wrestling. It's a company in Norwich in England. And along the journey of learning to wrestle, which was a childhood dream of mine, I got to figure out a couple of my classic childhood questions around wrestling, some of which I knew the answer to, but it's good to experience it firsthand and really feel it out. And the big one was, how much does pro wrestling hurt, or does it hurt at all? And I knew the answer was going to be yes, but to what extent and what things hurt the most. So I can talk through that now. And the first thing that I noticed when I started training on my first day with Zach Knight, who is from AEW now, but I think recently just left, but is the brother of Paige or Saraya from WWE and AEW. The first thing I learned on my first day here, got my reminder, is the intensity that you can have. And I think a big part of the training element of pro wrestling is also, it's one of those things you can make of it what you will in terms of how intense you want to make it, like any sport or any physical endeavor. So I think on the first day, they really wanted to put me through my paces. So I did lots of sprints around the ring. I did lots of rolls, practicing rolls across the ring. I did lots of things like arm drags, hip tosses. Took lots of back bumps, but like self-inflicted back bumps. So essentially it's practicing for when you get dropped onto your back in any of your major moves, like a suplex, a power bomb, a sidewalk slam or whatever. But you practice essentially learning how to put your arms out either side of you and learning how to distribute the impact across your back and across your legs as evenly as possible. So you're not just landing, say, flat on your head, or you're not landing flat onto one part of your back or across your ribs and hurting yourself. So you're learning how to minimize some of the impact, but ultimately when you land on your back, there's not really much you can do to avoid any kind of pain. So there's one easy thing cleared off there. Whenever you see someone get dropped onto their back, it's not going to be a comfortable sensation. But one thing I wrote down immediately as a big thing is the ring. And the ring that I noticed, especially our training ring, was a lower quality one than the one they use for the main events that they do when they travel for shows. And the ring, essentially, I'm pretty sure it's pretty standard for most wrestling companies, but it's just a metal frame. And then on top of the metal frame, you've got these like layers of plywood, like these sheets of plywood that go across the metal frame. You've got like this relatively thin layer of foam that sits on top of that, which is basically what the padding is. It's just a bit of foam, and then the mat's on top. So it's not really a very soft surface. It's definitely, the foam gives it a little bit of, and the plywood gives it a little bit of bounce, I guess, so that when you hit the ground, you don't just hit flat like you would on concrete. So if you hit the ground and bounce a bit, there's normally a good sign that it's not going to hurt as much as, say, just being hit on the floor outside. But it certainly doesn't feel lovely. And the thing is with the ring, depending on the ring quality, I even had to write down specifically quality of ring. I noticed that there is a big distinction between, a really good ring and a ring that's maybe a bit older. Because if you've got an older ring, sometimes the sheets of wood, they can separate and there might be little holes where if you get hit in that area, you're basically just hitting kind of foam and then metal underneath, and it's very uncomfortable in those areas. So if you're in a nice, fresh, new ring, the ropes are all nice and bouncy, the floor's all freshly put in and everything, it's definitely a nicer feeling than in an older ring where it's a little bit more worn and there's more, I guess, spots where there might not be as much padding or things might be a little bit faded and you could just hit the wrong area at the wrong time and it could be uncomfortable. So that was one thing I had to write down. But yeah, back bumps. I mentioned this already, but back bumps and front bumps, those for me were actually the least comfortable things to do. So the voluntary front bumps and back bumps, in other words, like if someone's going to clothesline you or if they're going to hit you and you just throw yourself onto your back or you throw yourself onto your front, you can definitely minimize impact, but I think it's very unnatural, so I think it takes quite a while, and I think the professionals obviously are much better at this than I was, obviously, but that was the toughest thing for me, because when you're just throwing yourself to the ground, your body wants to tighten up, and when you tighten up, it typically is going to hurt more when you hit the ground, because you're all tense. Ideally, you want to be kind of loose, and you want to be in the right position, and when you're tense, it's hard to get into a good position. You just sort of hit the ground a bit firmly. So I found those really tough, and I took loads of back bumps. I actually winded myself a couple of times taking back bumps because it can knock the wind out of you a bit, and you just, if you just throw yourself onto your back in any surface, after a while you're gonna start to struggle with breathing. So I remember on my first day, I took so many back bumps and I did so many rolls and hip tosses and stuff. I started to get dizzy and I started to feel a bit sick, and I was like, oh my God, if this happens every single week now, 6 hours a week and 6 weeks of this training, I was thinking this is not going to be sustainable for me. And I consider myself, relatively athletic, or at least I've got a sports background. So, doing physical activity wasn't new to me, but the volume of torque, the volume of throwing yourself around, the volume of running and then slamming, it is a different kind of training that I think your body has to adjust to. Which leads me into slams. So I actually found slams and taking slams, like your suplex, like I said, sidewalk slam, power bomb, that stuff was easier for me than back bumps and front bumps, only because the other person who's slamming you down, it makes it feel a little bit easier than just throwing yourself to the floor. I feel like it's a little bit more natural, so you can kind of like focus more on how you're going to position your body and minimize impact, rather than thinking, oh, I've got to jump up in the air and throw myself onto the ground. They're doing that job for you. So I actually didn't find the suplexes and stuff as bad. Where the slams were tougher for me is when you're taking a bump where you're not being controlled as much by the other wrestler. So the F5, I took an F5 for the finish of my match, and an F5 was a horrible move to take for me, because you're not, if you think about like a power slam, for example, or a body slam, you're going to be pressed into the position, and the person who's wrestling with you makes sure that you land nice and flat. Whereas in an F5, they just throw you off the shoulders and spin you in the air. So when I was F5'd, I landed, I think, across my ribs and on my side. So that was a very uncomfortable move for me. And I was still hurting about 2 weeks after taking that move. So yeah, don't recommend taking an F5. Punches and kicks, those actually weren't too bad. And again, this is really down to the person who you're wrestling with and how much they take care of you. But with punches and kicks, if someone knows what they're doing and they rein it in, and they don't really like lay in punches and try to hit you, and they just know how to make it look good, I didn't really feel a lot of anything. You feel something, because obviously they're going to still make contact with maybe their forearm, or they'll still kick you a bit. But the whole job of the wrestler that you're facing is to try to minimize the pain that you're experiencing. They're not supposed to really lay in a punch and a kick just to hurt you for the sake of it. One thing I actually respected a lot with the Knight family in WAW was, before we had a battle royal, they made a real point to people to not deliberately hurt the other people they were facing with like additional chops, or making guys feel unnecessary pain. They just said, if you're going to do that, you're not going to impress us. Like, don't mess around and try to impress us by trying to pretend like you're tough. Like, just wrestle properly was kind of their advice. Be safe. And I think that is the best advice you can give, because a lot of us who follow wrestling, you hear those horror stories of someone trying to be tough and then they end up just really hurting someone. And there's no need to do that. I think the main thing I learned is just how important the other person is to keeping you safe and to making you feel comfortable in the ring. So yeah, punches and kicks for me weren't bad at all. If someone wanted to lay in punches and kicks, it could definitely hurt. But the guys I wrestled with were very good at making me feel safe. So that was nice. Or nice as it could be. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than some of the other things. Submission holds. So I actually had a session where one of the guys showed me what the difference was between applying the submission hold properly, so things like your headlock, or even like a figure four or an arm bar. And he kind of showed me that this is the professional wrestling version. In other words, like, this is how you can kind of make it look not too painful. And then this would be the version where, if you want to really hurt someone, this is how you would do it. He said it in a way to sort of not, so I had understanding of the move, but also to appreciate that these aren't moves to mess around with. And I think, again, it's one of those things where I didn't feel too much pain from the submission holds. I felt a bit of discomfort, because obviously, like, when guys are trying to make a move look good, there's a fine line between, putting you in the hold enough so that it still makes the audience like invested, but also not taking it too far and choking you out, for example, with a headlock. So they weren't comfortable, but they were fine. It's one of those things where you just you trust the other person and you hope that they don't do anything silly. But it definitely could hurt, but it shouldn't hurt too much. So overall, that would bring me to my overall worsts. I've written even down the worsts. Anything involving torque and height. So if you're spinning in the air, or if you're being twisted around and you're not in control and you're going from a height and you're being dropped onto your back or your front or head, God forbid, or wherever, I don't recommend it. Any big self bumps where if someone's going to clothesline you and you're going to do a dramatic jump and just land straight on your back, I hated those personally. The best for me were things like punches, kicks, rolls, and submissions. But again, as we've seen, there's been a growing popularity in guys really laying in their forearms, chopping each other into oblivion, kicking each other, with super kicks so close that they kick them in the chin. Any of these things can hurt, which brings me to I wrote a conclusion down to remind myself of what the main thing was that I took away, which is really, because I didn't want to spend today just sort of ripping apart pro wrestling and saying and illegitimizing it, because to me it's a very legitimate thing. So it's not that you should just take punches, kicks, and submissions and say, oh, well, they're the boring part of wrestling and you should just take loads of big bumps and jumps. That's not the point. I think the point is that with wrestling, it's you're a stuntman essentially. And like someone like Jackie Chan, who is a stuntman, he's broken nearly every bone in his body, because when you're doing stuff like this that has high risk and it has elements of impact, elements of twisting, elements of jumping, leaping, and you're doing it consistently over and over again, any of the moves I mentioned are gonna hurt at some point to varying degrees, and they're gonna hurt more and more the more you do them. And a professional wrestler is doing these moves all the time. So nothing about this stuff is comfortable and nice and easy. I think ultimately the job of the wrestler, like in a stuntman's case, is to just try to make sure it hurts as little as possible. And I think one thing that worries me sometimes and makes me cringe a bit when I watch wrestling on TV is this almost like a bloodlust from fans at times, where they want guys to try to do moves that visibly look like they're going to hurt. Take a bump on the edge of the ring, for example, so you're going to hit the metal frame, or jump from a ridiculous height into an area that's not padded, or give people, kicks to the face, but don't hold back and, put their hands behind them so they can't block it, or take chair shots straight to the head. To me, that's just silly. I feel like this is a profession and something to respect that hurts anyway. I think the job of the wrestlers, and thankfully I had, great wrestlers around me and great trainers around me who made it hurt as little as possible. But even when I finished training, I loved it, but I didn't want to pursue it any further, even on an amateur level, because of the injury risk. And I think even in a safer environment like that, I felt the injury risk regularly. So yeah, it definitely hurts. After my match, and after many training sessions, I was in discomfort. And I can imagine over a number of years, it hurts an awful lot. So it needs a lot of respect, but I don't think people should really try to do anything stupid to make it hurt any more than it needs to, because it's definitely something that already hurts enough. So that would be my big conclusion. So if anyone's curious about trying wrestling training, I definitely recommend it. It was good fun. It was a childhood dream of mine to do a match, to really go all at it with training. But I wouldn't assume that it's going to be really easy, or that guys will go easy on you, because especially where I was, there were tough guys there who were being respectful to other people. And I think that's where you want the profession to be ideally. You want people who can take the hard hits, but they're not trying to give the hard hits. They're being as safe as they can in a dangerous environment. So yeah, fun experience, but maybe I'll try it again, but I'm not in any rush to do more professional wrestling anytime soon.